Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
Are you a business owner tired of paying exorbitant credit card fees? Call now to get an evaluation. If we cannot beat your current prices, you receive a $250 credit card. Call 818-583-7328 for more information. I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. For over 30 years, the Center for the Treatment of Anxiety and Mood Disorders has been providing care to children, adolescents, and adults who suffer from anxiety and mood disorders. My guest today is the founder and clinical director, Dr Rosen, who has been associated with medical director David Ross, who's a doctor, and they have been working together to provide the highest level of clinical care from the outside. Dr. Rosen, I think it's important that people understand what a really good, in your case, you're a PhD. What makes you a person who is able to deal with very heavy-duty subjects? And if I was looking for somebody to deal with me, or somebody in our audience was looking for somebody who could be really helpful to them, what are the different traits that person in your position must have?
Well, that's a very complicated question, but let me try and answer it in the most helpful way. I think that obviously the first part of the foundation has to be the training, the education and training. The PhD has the most training in the field of mental health. The mental health field is made up of different disciplines, so the amount of training varies from discipline to discipline. But I think the first step would be to find somebody who has a good amount of training and also related to the particular problem that you may be presenting, so that if your problem is anxiety, you really want to find someone who is well trained and primarily devotes their practice to the treatment of anxiety. If your problem is depression, well, it's the same principle. And if your problem is, for instance, a marriage problem, well, then you want to see somebody who primarily does that. The difficulty most patients find today is that if they look on the Internet and they find a particular person, that person may say they specialize in, and then they list 20 or 30 different problem areas that they specialize in. It doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm just curious. I mean, the average person who's dealing with anxiety and mood disorders and various other problems that exist, unfortunately, under the mental health tag, if you will, or different, doesn't matter. You get the point. How do they look for that? Because the average person, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't know. I mean, they don't really.
You're right.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the good thing about the Internet today is that most people who are in practice do put on their webpage information in more detail than we used to have when it was just an advertised in the yellow pages. So I think the person who's looking for help has the ability to go on the Internet and locate a person in their vicinity who, based on what they read in their website, they can say to themselves, well, that person looks like they have a lot of experience working with my particular problem. It's not as difficult anymore as it used to be.
That's very good to hear, actually. Now, let's really get into the whole field of anxiety and depression. It seems, and your site, your website has described the fact that it's on the rise. And I want to know from your experience why that is happening.
Well, I think some of it is a function of education and the public knowing more about particular difficulties with anxiety and mood. But I think most of it's due to the increase in incidence rate of anxiety and depression is due to the world that we live in today, which is primarily related to a vast amount of ongoing, constant information that people are inundated with, mainly internet, social media, multitasking, smartphones, and a lifestyle that is much more complicated and demanding than it was even 20 to 25 years ago.
Yeah. Now, the fact of the matter is that things are getting even more involved in the internet and all kinds of IT issues. And, in fact, they're indicating, which is really interesting, that today there's thousands of jobs available in that field, and that is going to be the next, the millenniums are going to be part of that, and then after that it's going to even be more intricate. Now, with that said, if you were standing in front of an audience giving a talk about this issue of people not sort of doing a tete-a-tete thing, what would you say to the audience, and how would you resolve the problem of course, this sort of being separated from people, more of a society that is based upon just doing all this internet stuff?
Well, I think first of all is to be able to identify very clearly that it is a process that's happened over the last number of years. Our world has dramatically changed. Since the 1980s and 90s, it's a completely different world today. We didn't see people walking down the street looking at their iPhones or constantly attached to some smartphone device. We didn't see people texting instead of talking. We didn't see people, as soon as they took a picture, sending that picture to somewhere else. People were much more in the present and with people instead of technology. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem that creates is it's a different level of exposure to stimulation and stress to the nervous system. Our nervous systems are exposed to things that they weren't exposed to before because of the technology. And people aren't necessarily yet aware of what that causes in the nervous system, but it's definitely causing problems in the central nervous system of human beings. Now, we know that science has expressed to us how toxins in the environment, whether it be in the air or the water, affect the human body. That's no surprise any longer, but people are not really educated about the effects of the technology on the nervous system. And it's in many respects just as toxic, and it creates different symptoms than if you were exposed to mold or you were exposed to carcinogens, but it does affect the human being and the nervous system, and the ultimate effects are symptoms related to anxiety and depression.
Right.
And there's no question we have evidence of that.
And what about evidence-based scientific work that's been done by different universities, for example, or different medical companies? What have that indicated? Is it getting to be more and more of a problem, or have they figured out a way to kind of adjust the situation?
Well, there's no question that the evidence is there. If we look at studies, and they're just really in their infancy, but we can see what prolonged exposure to internet, for instance, and computer technology. We can see the effect on the brain when we look at functional imagery studies of the brain and so on. We can see the effect, and we don't have a solution yet, other than to say limit your exposure. But even though a particular person, we all know, well, yeah, it's probably a good idea to limit our exposure, we just don't do it. Any given day, we wake up and we go right ahead to the day. And even if you try your best to limit your use of the devices, your phone rings, you get a text message, you get an email, you are told to look up something on the internet, or did you see the news? And, you're just not going to be able to control yourself. And there you are, and you've spent hours each day on the use of that technology.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that I'm interested in knowing is about medications.
Yeah.
I think I might have talked to you about this before, but let me just tell you a short story. Years ago, I dealt with a nutritionist, and the nutritionist talked about the fact that these big companies like McDonald's, for example, were creating situations where they were giving people unhealthy food. And food does matter in what your disposition is, whether it makes you moody or whatever the case might be, because you really need good nutrition to stay healthy. And she said, one of the problems that we have is that if we educate people about what is good nutrition, but we have to fight. McDonald's makes a lot of money, and they can hire lawyers. And the problem, unfortunately, is we can't fight them. So does that exist in your field as well, where the medical companies are producing all kinds of medications and they want to get them on, the market and get people to take them?
Well, yeah, I think in general, the pharmaceutical industries, they make their money back on for the drugs that they've created by making sure that the public knows about it. That's why you see commercials on TV about every drug, and even telling the population, make sure you tell your doctor about this drug, as if the doctor didn't already know about it. So, like anything, it's business. I think in the field of psychiatry, it's not as aggressive as some other fields. The medications that are being created keep improving as we learn more about the brain each decade. But medicine does have a place in the treatment of psychiatric problems. There's no question of that. And I've seen many people helped by it. I've seen many people not helped and actually hurt because, they maybe went to a primary care doctor or somebody else and was given a prescription and never followed for the next 2 years. So it's got its pluses and minuses, but it definitely has a role in the treatment.
I hear you. Now, the situation that we're dealing with today is that, people they're dealing with a series of different issues and a series of different problems. Now, forget the medication for a moment. If you had an opportunity to treat somebody, again, with anxiety and depression, and you decided at this point that you don't want to use medication, what treatments are available today that are, really working and people are following them, and you really tell them keep it up? So give me some ideas of what people can do to reduce the problems of mental issues.
Well, there's two parts to that. One, in terms of prevention, some of the things we've even already talked about in terms of limiting exposure to things like the internet and social media and multiple sources of stress. Prevention is very important. Having a balanced diet, so to speak, in terms of activity, so that you are not one-dimensional in terms of what your day looks like. It's not all work or it's not all time on the internet. It's mixed between work and exercise and play and relaxation. We know more and more that balance, just like in nature, is extremely important. But in terms of treatment, the first thing we do is really we do an assessment to understand what is the etiology or the cause of the symptoms that the person's having. That's essential in terms of determining what is the best treatment, whether it is medication, whether it's medication mixed with psychotherapy, etc. Once you do that, and if you assume or you decide that medication isn't necessary in this situation, well, for the treatment of anxiety and mood disorders, pretty much over the last 20 years, research has shown us that the overwhelming most efficacious treatment for these two disorders is what we call cognitive behavior therapy, and also mixed with more traditional psychotherapy. But cognitive behavior therapy seems to be the most effective and efficient. We also mix that with multiple types of treatments, including Mindfulness meditation has become a very powerful source of help, both in the office with patients and also giving them a tool to use when they're not in the office and they're in their day-to-day activity. I also, because of the research we have, really stress the role of cardiovascular exercise for patients. And when people start to accept that and they can begin to utilize those techniques, exercise, meditation, even eating healthy, they really do find that they have a tremendous impact on these two disorders. So it's not just talk therapy. It's a mixture of lifestyle changes and focusing in on methods to help with the symptoms.
Well, let's talk about those methods that you just discussed, and I'd like some definitions. When you talk about mindfulness, needless to say, I mean, it speaks for itself, but I think people don't really quite understand what that means. So I would like you to give them a definition of it.
Okay.
And perhaps you could even give us a little story. You don't have to mention any names, but I would love to hear what experiences you've had with people dealing with that.
Well, the concept of mindfulness is based on basically a Buddhist philosophy of being in the present. Our world today, because of technology, is a very limited amount of time that we actually spend in the present. We may be sitting in a particular place, but we may be somewhere else on the computer in terms of information. We may be talking to somebody else in a different place. We may be multitasking. We may be planning. But we're very rarely in the present. So the classic example of that is if you ask a person these three questions. So if you ask a person when they're in the shower in the morning, are they in the shower? Most people will look a little quizzical, but then they'll realize, no, they may be physically in the shower, but they're not experiencing the shower. They're busy thinking about what's going to be in a couple of hours. And when they're out to dinner that night in a very nice restaurant, if you ask, are you in the restaurant, they'll say, well, I was there, but I really don't even remember what I ate because I was planning tomorrow's meeting, and so on and so forth. We're never really experiencing where we are. And what that does is it puts a lot of pressure on the brain and the nervous system, and creates ultimately a lot of stress. And in the world we live in today, that's become much greater. So mindfulness and mindfulness meditation are a way of very quickly, through the meditation process, which could be 10 minutes, helping the person become very present.
Yes.
And turn off all of the excess stimulation and give the brain a rest, and a kind of a restorative period for the brain to rest and rejuvenate. And that's basically what it is. We used to have much more of that. We never really spent as much time somewhere else as we do now because of all of the stimulation and technology.
Yeah. And do you have a little story for us? Anything that you can tell us about some of the experiences you've had with some of your patients that indicate how you treated them and how they reacted to, as you said, mindful meditation and, being in the present and breathing and all the different things that are part of this situation
Sure.
that you're kind of involved in right now?
One example would be somebody who came in to see me and they were having significant problems with sleep. Their appetite had diminished. They were very irritable. They were anxious. They were having panic attacks. And upon exploration, the primary issue wasn't that there was anything so terrible going on in the person's life and they did not have a history of trauma, but their life had become sort of out of control with an inordinate amount of pressures and stressors during the day, responsibilities, multiple responsibilities, whether it be with work, family, and the person was getting up at 5 in the morning, very typical of what we see today, getting up 5 in the morning, hurrying up to the gym, coming back, getting the kids ready for school, then leaving for work, taking care of all the responsibilities that they had at work, which was basically a lot of work on the road as a salesperson, coming back, making sure they were back by 4 o'clock so that they could take the kids from school to after-school activities, make sure they got home by 5 o'clock so that they could finish their homework, make dinner, get the kids, and just like on and on and on. And every day was like that. Doesn't sound all that unfamiliar to people, but when you have that on a day-to-day basis for a long period of time, very often the nervous system wears down. So what we have to do with that kind of person is make sure that somewhere during their average day, they may be able to introduce a little 5 to 10 minute concept of mindfulness meditation. Somewhere on the weekend, they unplug so that they can kind of rejuvenate themselves as humans and their nervous system. Mindfulness meditation before sleep rather than sitting on their computer and getting more work done, which then activates the brain and makes the person not be able to fall asleep. So a lot of day-to-day lifestyle changes that would help the person begin to get their nervous system back in a calmer state.
As I listen to you, I say to myself, oh, my God, this is nerve-wracking, even for somebody just listening to what you have to say about this. All
yes,
right.
And it's not uncommon, and people didn't used to live like that.
I know, and, well, wait a minute, hold on. Our ancestors, if you will, I'm talking about our grandparents perhaps, or their great-grandparents, they worked hard. They had no choice as well, and many of them were immigrants, so they came to this country and they found themselves in a place where they had to work, and it wasn't easy. Now, last but not least, what I know that we have to talk about how retirement affects people. We have to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. There are so many different things that are under the umbrella of mental disorders, and I think our audience needs to know a little bit more about that. So let's do another show and perhaps other shows that deal with these subjects because, again, it's about people understanding what mental health issues really mean to them and to the society. So with
that would be great. I'd love to.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so to that extent, I want to thank you, Dr. Rosen, for being on the Susan Brender Show. Let's talk about all these different things so we educate people in the way that they need to be educated. Again, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.